The Hundred Years' War wasn't just a conflict, it was an entire era of clashing kingdoms, where the fate of nations hung in the balance with every sword swung and every arrow loosed. For over a century, England and France waged a brutal struggle that reshaped borders, toppled dynasties, and forged legends. But here's what most histories overlook. It wasn't the war itself that changed Europe, but 25 explosive moments when everything hung in the balance. Moments when a single decision, a sudden charge, or a stray arrow could rewrite the future of an entire continent. Today, we're stepping onto those blood-soaked battlefields where kings gambled their crowns, peasants became heroes, and the medieval world trembled at the stakes. From the mud of Crecy to the gates of Orléans, these weren't just battles, they were turning points that echo through history, and their ripple effects still shape our world today. Ready to witness the clashes that decided the fate of Europe? Let's begin where it all started, with a battle so shocking, it changed warfare forever. Picture this: a tangled web of royal bloodlines, contested thrones, and a simmering rivalry stretching back generations. That's where the 100 Years' War truly began. On the surface, it was a fight over land. England's Plantagenet kings held vast territories in France, while the French crown sought to reclaim them. But dig deeper and you'll find a powder keg of ambition and pride. When Charles IV of France died without a male heir in 1328, England's Edward III saw an opening. His mother was Charles' sister, giving him a claim to the French throne. But the French nobility rejected the idea of an English king ruling over them, sparking a feud that would ignite into all-out war 9 years later. This wasn't just a medieval land grab, it was a clash of identities. France was striving to unite under a single banner, while England sought to maintain its continental influence. And then there were the economics. The wool trade, taxation, and control of lucrative Flemish cities added fuel to the fire. But what made this war different from earlier conflicts? Scale and innovation. Armies grew larger, tactics evolved, and the longbow, a simple but devastating weapon, would soon rewrite the rules of battle. Meanwhile, the war became a proving ground for new ideas of nationalism, where soldiers fought not just for a lord but for a kingdom. And let's not forget the human drama. From the Black Death ravaging both nations to the rise of peasant revolts, the war unfolded against a backdrop of social upheaval. It was an era where a teenage girl, Joan of Arc, could rally an entire nation, and where a single defeat could topple kings. Over a century of fighting, Europe would witness unimaginable carnage, but also the birth of modern states. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Now, with the stage set, we're ready to step onto the battlefield where history was forged in blood and steel. The war raging across the fields of France was only half the story, because while knights clashed on land, another deadly struggle unfolded on the open seas. Ships became floating fortresses, their decks slick with blood, as England and France fought for something just as vital as territory: control of the water itself. Without secure sea lanes, armies starved, reinforcements faltered, and entire campaigns crumbled before they began. England's secret weapon wasn't just the longbow, it was their nimble, weather-beaten vessels that could strike like falcons. French ships may have been larger, but English captains mastered the art of swift, relentless attacks, turning the Channel into their hunting ground. Then came 24th of June, 1340, the day the tides turned at Sluys. The French fleet, anchored in a defensive line, believed they were untouchable. But the English didn't play by their rules. Under Edward III's command, they closed in like wolves, boarding enemy ships with brutal efficiency. The result, a massacre so complete that chroniclers claimed you could walk across the wreckage without getting your feet wet. This wasn't just about sinking ships. Victory at sea meant England could land troops wherever they pleased, choke off French trade, and keep their own armies fed and armed. Meanwhile, France's battered navy struggled to protect its coastlines, leaving towns vulnerable to sudden raids. Every captured supply ship drained enemy morale. Every burned harbor weakened their resolve. The war's fate wasn't just decided in grand charges or sieges. It was shaped by the silent, grueling battles fought where the sky met the waves. And as we'll see, this maritime struggle would only grow fiercer as the war dragged on. The fields outside the small village of Crecy became a slaughterhouse on that August afternoon in 1346, a place where medieval warfare changed forever. Picture an exhausted English army, outnumbered nearly 2-1, their backs to the forest as the sun dipped low in the sky. Across the muddy slope, the flower of French nobility gleamed in their polished armor, confident their heavy cavalry would crush these invaders in minutes. They didn't realize they were charging straight into a storm of arrows, and straight into history. Edward III didn't just bring longbows to this fight, he brought a revolution. While French knights still clung to the old code of chivalry, the English king had drilled his archers relentlessly. These weren't just peasants with sticks, they were specialists capable of loosing 12 arrows a minute with terrifying accuracy. And Edward positioned them on high ground, flanked by ditches his men dug overnight traps to break the French charge before it even reached them. What happened next was sheer carnage. Wave after wave of French knights, weighed down by armor, plowed into the muddy chaos as arrows rained down like steel hail. Horses screamed, men drowned in their own blood, and by nightfall, the cream of French nobility lay dead, including the blind King John of Bohemia, his knights tying their reins to his horse so he could charge one last time. The English lost perhaps a few hundred, the French over 4,000, but Crecy wasn't just a victory, it was a wake-up call. Suddenly, the armored knight, the pinnacle of medieval warfare for centuries, looked obsolete. A disciplined commoner with a longbow could now bring down nobility from 200 yards away. Kings across Europe took note, warfare would never be the same. And for England, this triumph became the blueprint proof that brains, terrain, and a simple wooden bow could topple empires. Edward III didn't stop at Crecy. He knew one victory alone wouldn't break France. His sights locked onto Calais, a coastal fortress so vital that controlling it meant strangling French trade while securing England's foothold on the continent. But capturing this prize wouldn't be a swift strike. What followed was a grueling 11-month siege that pushed both sides to the brink of human endurance. Imagine the scene: English forces, fresh from their triumph at Crecy, encircled Calais' towering walls, cutting off every supply route. Inside, the townspeople caught between their king's orders to hold fast and the gnawing emptiness in their bellies faced an impossible choice. As weeks turned to months, they ate dogs, rats, even boiled leather. Meanwhile, Edward's patience hardened into ruthlessness. When French reinforcements tried to break the siege, his longbowmen and entrenched positions shattered their attempts, leaving Calais to its fate. The surrender, when it came, was theater and humiliation. 6 barefoot burghers, nooses around their necks, offered their lives for the town's survival. Only Queen Philippa's tearful intervention spared them, but Edward's mercy ended there. He emptied Calais of its French population, replacing them with English settlers, and turned the port into a dagger pointed at France's heart. For over 200 years, English soldiers would march from its gates, a constant reminder of a kingdom's defiance. This wasn't just about territory. The siege revealed war's slow, grinding reality, how logistics and starvation could achieve what swords couldn't. While Crecy showcased battlefield brilliance, Calais proved dominance required more than courage. It demanded the will to outlast. And for France, the loss wasn't just tactical. It was a wound to pride that would fester for generations, fueling a hunger for revenge no treaty could soothe. Yet amid the suffering, an unexpected truth emerged. War wasn't just fought by kings and knights. the starving women and children of Calais, the nameless laborers digging trenches. They were the unspoken casualties of a clash between crowns. Their silent endurance wrote history as surely as any charge, and as we'll see, the echoes of this siege would resonate long after the last English banner flew over the city walls. The English victories at Crecy and Calais had shaken France to its core, but the war was far from over. A decade later, in the sun-scorched fields near Poitiers, the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, would deliver another crushing blow that left France reeling. This time, it wasn't just about battlefield tactics, it was about capturing a king. The French had learned hard lessons since Crecy, yet they still clung to the belief that sheer numbers and noble cavalry charges would prevail. King John II assembled a formidable army, determined to crush the English once and for all. But the Black Prince played a different game. Low on supplies and outnumbered, he chose his ground carefully, positioning his forces between thick hedges and marshes, funneling the French into a killing zone where their numerical advantage meant nothing. Then came the masterstroke. While French knights struggled through the rough terrain, the English dismounted their own men-at-arms, turning them into an immovable wall of steel. Behind them, longbowmen unleashed volley after volley, turning the sky black with arrows. The French charge collapsed into chaos, knights bogged down and butchered where they stood. And then disaster. King John himself, fighting valiantly, was surrounded and taken prisoner. The repercussions were immediate and devastating. France's leadership disintegrated overnight. Nobles scrambled for power, peasants revolted against crushing taxes, and the country teetered on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, England demanded a ransom so enormous, 3 million gold crowns, that it nearly bankrupted France just to pay it. But Poitiers proved something deeper. War wasn't just won on the battlefield. Economics and politics were just as lethal as any arrow. The captured king became a bargaining chip, his absence destabilizing France for years. And the English, they cemented their reputation as masters of asymmetric warfare, where terrain, discipline, and brutal efficiency could topple kingdoms. The lesson was clear sometimes: capturing one man could shake an entire nation. Yet even in victory, the Black Prince couldn't have foreseen what came next. France, humiliated and fractured, would soon find a way to fight back, not just with swords, but with something far more dangerous: a resurgence of national identity. And that shift would change the course of the war forever. The rain had been falling for days, turning the field near Agincourt into a treacherous sea of mud, the kind that could swallow a night whole. By October 25, 1415, Henry V's exhausted English army found themselves cornered, outnumbered nearly 5 to 1, with sickness thinning their ranks and hunger gnawing at their resolve. Retreat wasn't an option, surrender meant annihilation. Yet what happened next wasn't just a battle, it was a legend in the making, a clash that would define the very soul of English defiance. Henry didn't just rely on longbows, he weaponized the land itself. His men took position on a freshly plowed field narrowed by dense forests, forcing the French into a funnel where their numbers became a liability. Then came his secret weapon, thousands of sharpened stakes driven into the ground at angles, a makeshift fortress against cavalry. When the French knights charged, their heavy armor became a death sentence. Horses floundered in the mud, riders toppled under arrow storms, and the chaos turned into a slaughterhouse. The English archers, many sick with dysentery, unleashed volleys so thick they blotted out the sky. But the real horror came after the arrows stopped. The French vanguard, bogged down and disorganized, became easy prey for English knights and men at arms wielding axes, swords, and even mallets. The battle dissolved into a brutal melee where French nobility, laden with costly armor, were dragged into the muck and butchered. By day's end, thousands of French lay dead, including some of the kingdom's highest-ranking nobles. English losses fewer than 500. Agincourt's brilliance wasn't just in its tactics, it was in its symbolism. Here was a king who fought on foot alongside his men, a band of happy few defying impossible odds. Shakespeare later immortalized that spirit, but the truth was even messier, even more extraordinary. This battle proved once again that medieval warfare wasn't about glory, it was about adaptation. A muddy field and a well-placed stake could undo centuries of chivalric tradition. Yet Agincourt's shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield. For England, it became a rallying cry, proof that divine favor and shrewd leadership could topple giants. For France, it was a wake-up call, a humiliation so deep it forced a reckoning with their fractured leadership. And for warfare itself, the lesson was clear. The age of armored knights riding to certain victory was over. The future belonged to those who could turn disadvantage into opportunity, whether through terrain, technology, or sheer audacity. But victories, no matter how stunning, rarely end wars. Henry's triumph at Agincourt would open doors, yet the path ahead held sieges, betrayals, and a twist of fate no one saw coming. Because in war, even the greatest underdog stories have a second act. The English grip on France seemed unbreakable by 1428. After decades of war, their troops held key strongholds across the north, and the French crown teetered on the edge of collapse. Then came Orléans, the last major obstacle standing between England and total domination. As winter set in, English forces encircled the city, choking its supply lines with a ring of fortified towers bristling with cannons. The siege dragged on for months, starvation looming, hope fading. Then, on a misty morning in April 1429, history pivoted on the arrival of an unlikeliest of saviors, a 17-year-old peasant girl in armor claiming to hear the voice of God. Joan of Arc didn't just bring a sword to Orléans, she carried something far more potent, unshakable conviction. French commanders, skeptical at first, couldn't ignore the effect she had on weary soldiers and desperate citizens. Here was a girl who spoke of divine purpose, who dressed like a knight but walked among the troops sharing their rations, washing their wounds. When she led a daring nighttime attack to capture the key English bastion of St. Loup, morale exploded. Suddenly, the impossible seemed within reach. What followed wasn't just a military victory, it was psychological warfare. Joan's presence unraveled English confidence. Superstition spread among their ranks. Was this armored maiden truly sent by heaven? Her audacity, riding straight into arrow fire to plant scaling ladders against enemy walls, unnerved even veteran commanders. By May, the siege collapsed, the English retreating in disarray. But the real triumph wasn't just the liberation of Orléans, it was the reawakening of a fractured nation. Joan's victory proved the English weren't invincible, and her faith became contagious. Yet Orléans revealed a deeper truth about medieval warfare. Battles weren't won by numbers alone. A single figure could ignite the collective spirit of an army, turning desperation into defiance. Joan's leadership, her ability to embody both saint and soldier, rewrote the rules of engagement. For France, this was the spark that began the long, bloody road to reclaiming their kingdom. And for England, it was the first crack in their continental empire, a warning that no siege towers or longbows could withstand the power of a people who believed their cause was sacred. The echoes of Orléans would resonate far beyond its walls. Joan's meteoric rise and her eventual capture and martyrdom would cement her as a legend. But in that pivotal spring of 1429, she was simply the girl who refused to let a city fall, proving that sometimes history hinges not on kings or treaties, but on the courage of those who dare to answer its call. Fresh from their triumph at Orléans, the French army carried something they hadn't felt in decades: momentum. But one liberated city wasn't enough to win the war. The English still held firm across northern France, their longbowmen the terror of every battlefield. Then came June 18, 1429, near the quiet village of Pâté. In a matter of hours, the French didn't just win, they shattered the myth of English invincibility with a brutal lesson in speed and shock tactics. This time, there were no fortified walls or desperate sieges, just open countryside where the French could finally use their greatest strength, heavy cavalry. Spotting a small English vanguard, French scouts realized this wasn't just a patrol, it was the precursor to a larger force. Seizing the moment, La Hire and the Duke of Alençon led a devastating charge before the English could even dig in or plant their defensive stakes. The longbowmen, caught unprepared in the open, had no chance. French knights thundered into their ranks, swords flashing, turning what should have been a skirmish into a rout. The numbers told the story: fewer than 100 French casualties, while the English lost over 2,000, including some of their most experienced commanders. But Pâté's true significance wasn't just in the body count. It proved the French had learned to exploit their enemies' weaknesses, striking fast before archers could deploy, using terrain to their advantage, and refusing to play by England's rules. The longbow's dominance wasn't absolute, it depended on preparation, and at Pâté the English had none. For France, this victory was a psychological earthquake. After years of humiliation, they'd finally beaten the English at their own game, not through sheer numbers, but through cunning and aggression. Joan of Arc, though not leading the charge, became a symbol of this new spirit. Meanwhile, England faced an uncomfortable truth: their tactical supremacy was crumbling. The war, once so nearly won, was now a bloody seesaw where every battle could tip the scales. Yet Pâté also hinted at a darker reality: medieval warfare's ruthless unpredictability. One misstep, one moment of failed reconnaissance, and an army could be annihilated before the real fight even began. The English wouldn't make that mistake again, but the damage was done. France, for the first time in generations, was on the offensive, and the tide of history was beginning to turn. What came next wasn't just more battles, but a reckoning with the war's staggering human cost. A reminder that behind every charge and countercharge were shattered lives and a continent weary of bloodshed. And as the conflict dragged on, both sides would learn that even the clearest victory could sow the seeds of future strife. The thick morning mist clung to the fields of Formigny in April 1450, hiding the true scale of what was coming. After decades of war, the English still clung to Normandy, but France had rebuilt itself not just in spirit but in firepower. This wouldn't be another Agincourt or Crecy where longbows decided the day. This time, the thunder of cannons would herald a new age of warfare, and the English army would learn firsthand how drastically the rules had changed. French commanders had spent years studying their enemy's tactics, and now they perfected a deadly hybrid approach. As English longbowmen scrambled to form their defensive lines, French artillery crews wheeled two massive cannons into position, bards capable of smashing through men and earthworks alike. The first shots landed with terrifying precision, scattering formations before the cavalry even moved. Then came the charge. Heavily armored knights surged forward, not as reckless nobles but as a coordinated hammer striking the anvil of gunfire. The effect was devastating. English archers, trained to hold ground against cavalry, found themselves shredded by cannon volleys before they could loose a single arrow. Those who survived the bombardment faced mounted French lancers riding through the smoke. Within hours, the field was littered with bodies, nearly 4,000 English dead compared to a few hundred French. But the real significance wasn't the bloodshed, it was the undeniable proof that warfare had evolved. Gunpowder was no longer a novelty, it was the future. Formigny didn't just mark another French victory, it revealed a fundamental shift in power. England's once unbeatable longbow strategy, honed over a century, now faltered against an enemy blending medieval might with emerging technology. The French had adapted while their opponents clung to fading glory. Suddenly, castles that had withstood years of sieges became vulnerable to cannon fire. Cavalry charges, once dominant, now had to navigate fields raked by artillery. The very fabric of war was changing, and Europe's battlefields would never look the same. For France, this triumph sealed Normandy's fate. Within months, English strongholds fell like dominoes, but beyond territory, Formigny delivered a psychological coup. After generations of humiliation, France wasn't just winning, it was redefining how wars were fought. And for the English, the lesson was brutal. The era that had forged their greatest victories was ending, and clinging to the past meant courting annihilation. As the smoke cleared over Formigny, one truth stood stark. The medieval world's twilight had arrived, and the armies quickest to embrace the future would inherit the battlefield. Yet, even in this moment of transformation, the war's final act still loomed. Another confrontation waited on the horizon, where old grudges and new weapons would collide one last time, and the outcome would echo far beyond the 100 Years' War itself. The sun baked the fields near Castellon that sweltering July in 1453, but it wasn't just the heat that would scorch England's dreams that day. After over a century of bloodshed, the 100 Years' War had one final, brutal lesson to teach, a lesson written in smoke and cannon fire. The English, led by the aging John Talbot, marched toward what they thought would be another heroic stand. What they found instead was a fortified French camp bristling with over 300 cannons, trenches dug deep, and a new kind of warfare that would render their old tactics obsolete. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a killing zone. The French, under the brilliant tactician Jean Bureau, had turned the art of siegecraft inside out. Instead of assaulting walls, they became the fortress. Their gunpowder weapons weren't just support, they were the centerpiece, positioned to unleash hellish crossfires on anyone foolish enough to charge. When Talbot's men, desperate and outnumbered, rushed forward with longbows and swords, they were met with a storm of iron. Cannonballs tore through ranks, trenches funneled them into slaughter pens, and within an hour the field was a graveyard. Talbot himself, the last lion of England's fading glory, died trapped under his own fallen horse, an ignoble end for a man who'd fought across generations. Castellon's significance stretched far beyond its body count. This was the first European battle where artillery decided the outcome, a grim preview of wars to come. The medieval world's reliance on armored knights and massed archers crumbled in the face of concentrated firepower. But the battle's aftermath was just as telling. England, bled dry by decades of conflict, no longer had the resources or will to reclaim its lost territories. Calais, their last foothold in France, became a lonely outpost rather than a springboard for conquest. For France, Castellon was more than victory, it was catharsis. A kingdom once fractured by civil war and English invasion now stood united, its borders secured, its identity reforged in the crucible of war. The conflict that had begun with disputed succession and feudal squabbles ended with something unheard of in the 14th century. A sense of national destiny. Yet Castellon's legacy wasn't just about borders or bullets. It marked the quiet death of an era where individual heroics could sway battles, and the birth of a colder, more mechanistic age of warfare. The cannonball that killed Talbot didn't just end a life. It shattered the very idea of war as a noble contest, and as the smoke cleared over that bloody field, Europe stood on the brink of a new world, where kings would soon learn that the future belonged not to the bravest knight, but to the commander who best mastered the machines of destruction. The 100 Years' War had finally run its course, but the echoes of its battles, from Crecy to Castellon, would shape empires for centuries to come. Some wars end with treaties. This one ended with the thunder of guns, a fitting epitaph for an age that had witnessed both the zenith of chivalry and its obsolescence. And for England, the retreat across the Channel wasn't just a military withdrawal, It was the first step toward a new identity, one that would soon turn its gaze westward to oceans and horizons unknown. The clash of steel and the roar of cannons may have defined the 100 Years' War, but behind every charge and retreat stood the commanders who turned chaos into victory or disaster. What separated the legends from the forgotten? It wasn't just skill with a sword or knowledge of terrain. It was the intangible power of leadership, the ability to make an army believe the impossible was within reach. Take Edward III at Crecy, a king who didn't just command from a tent but stood shoulder to shoulder with his archers, turning a patch of muddy ground into a death trap for French chivalry. His genius lay in preparation, drilling his longbowmen until their hands bled, studying the landscape like a chessboard, and instilling discipline where others relied on brute force. Contrast that with the French nobility at Agincourt, their glittering armor and feudal pride leading them straight into a slaughterhouse of their own making. Leadership here wasn't about titles, it was about understanding the moment. Then there's Henry V, the warrior king who transformed dysentery-ridden peasants into the band of brothers that shattered France's elite. His St. Crispin's Day speech, whether Shakespeare's embellishment or not, captures a truth. Great commanders didn't just give orders, they forged identity. An English archer at Agincourt didn't fight for gold or land. He fought because Henry made him feel like part of something immortal. And how could we forget Joan of Arc? A teenage girl with no military training, yet she achieved what seasoned generals couldn't, breaking the siege of Orléans not just with tactics, but with sheer magnetism. Her faith was contagious, her courage reckless, and her presence alone unraveled enemy morale. The French didn't follow her because she outmaneuvered the English. They followed because she made them believe heaven was on their side. Yet for every Joan or Henry, there were leaders whose flaws cost thousands. The captured King John at Poitiers, whose rash charge turned him into a bargaining chip. Or the English commanders at Castellon, clinging to outdated tactics as cannon fire erased their ranks. The war's greatest lesson: no weapon, not the longbow, not gunpowder, could compensate for a leader who misunderstood their enemy, their own men, or the changing face of war itself. These figures remind us that history isn't just about maps and treaties. It's about the boy king who rallied a nation, the peasant girl who defied an empire, and the moments when a single voice in the chaos tipped the scales. Because in the end, the 100 Years' War wasn't won by swords alone. It was won by those who knew how to make ordinary men do extraordinary things. And as the dust settled, another force emerged, one that would reshape Europe even more than any battle. The slow, unstoppable rise of nationalism, where loyalty to a crown began to give way to something far more powerful. War has a way of turning kings into legends and battles into history. But behind every clash of armies lies a truth we often overlook: the unbearable weight carried by those never asked for glory. For every knight who fell at Agincourt, there were 100 nameless souls, peasants whose fields became battlegrounds, mothers hiding children from marauding soldiers, entire towns reduced to ashes in the span of an afternoon. The 100 Years' War wasn't just fought on open fields. It was etched into the lives of ordinary people, leaving scars no treaty could heal. Picture a French village in the path of an advancing army. Whether English or French, soldiers cared little for allegiances when hunger struck. Crops were seized, storehouses looted, and homes burned not out of strategy but necessity. Starvation became a weapon, and civilians paid the price. Chroniclers wrote of families eating grass, of streets littered with bodies too weak to bury. And when the Black Death swept through Europe mid-war, it didn't discriminate between soldier and farmer, only deepening the despair. For conscripted archers and men-at-arms, the war was a brutal lottery. English longbowmen, though celebrated for their skill, often returned home maimed if they returned at all. French peasants, forced to fund their king's ransom after Poitiers, faced taxes so crushing that revolts erupted across the countryside. The Jacquerie Uprising of 1358 saw villagers turn on their nobles with scythes and axes, not for crowns or thrones, but for bread and dignity. Yet amid the suffering, resilience flickered. Towns like Orléans rebuilt after sieges, their people clinging to faith and community. Women took up trades left vacant by dead husbands and sons, while merchants adapted to ruined roads by smuggling goods through war's shadows. Even the landscape bore witness. Forests were stripped for siege engines, rivers dammed to starve cities, and fields left fallow for decades. This hidden toll forces us to see the war anew. Battles like Crecy or Castellon weren't just turning points. They were tragedies multiplied by thousands of individual sorrows. The real cost of the 100 Years' War wasn't measured in territory gained or lost, but in generations shaped by hunger, trauma, and a quiet yearning for peace. And as the conflict dragged on, that yearning would slowly reshape not just borders but the very soul of Europe itself. For kings, war was a game of thrones. For the common people, it was the end of the world they knew, and in that chasm between power and suffering, we find the war's truest, most heartbreaking legacy. Midway through the 100 Years' War, a single weapon shifted the balance of power, not through brute force, but through terrifying efficiency. The English longbow wasn't just a tool, it was a revolution strung in new wood. With a draw weight heavier than a modern compound bow and a range that could pierce armor at 200 yards, this unassuming weapon turned peasants into the deadliest soldiers on the battlefield. But its real power lay in the training years of practice to fire 12 arrows a minute with lethal precision. At Crecy and Agincourt, disciplined volleys from these bows turned charging knights into pincushions, proving that skill could trump nobility. Then came the game-changer, gunpowder. What began as a novelty, crude cannons that terrified more with noise than damage evolved into a battlefield dominator by the war's end. The French victory at Formigny showcased artillery's brutal potential, but Castellon sealed the deal. There, hundreds of cannons mowed down England's finest in minutes, signaling the end of medieval warfare. Suddenly, castles that had stood for centuries crumbled under bombardments, and the age of chivalry gave way to the age of smoke and iron. Siegecraft underwent its own metamorphosis. Traditional turtling tactics, where defenders waited out attackers behind high walls, collapsed under new engineering. Mobile trebuchets, improved tunneling techniques, and even early forms of psychological warfare like catapulting diseased corpses into besieged cities turned stalemates into slaughterhouses. The siege of Calais demonstrated another chilling truth. Starvation could be deadlier than any sword, yet perhaps the most overlooked innovation was organizational. England's use of paid professional soldiers rather than feudal levies created armies that fought year-round with cohesion mercenaries couldn't match. France countered by centralizing command, blending gunpowder with cavalry in ways that foresaw Napoleon's strategies centuries early. These weren't just incremental upgrades, they were seismic shifts. The war didn't just redraw borders, it rewrote the rules of conflict, setting the stage for everything from the Spanish tercios to the trenches of World War I. And in that transformation lay an uncomfortable truth. Progress in warfare is measured not in glory, but in how efficiently men learn to kill each other. As the dust settled, another change became clear. Technology didn't just win battles, it reshaped societies. The longbow eroded feudal hierarchies by proving commoners could topple nobles. Cannon fire made city walls obsolete, forcing new forms of defense. And somewhere in the smoke, the medieval world faded, giving way to something both terrifying and modern. The battlefield of the 100 Years' War wasn't just a clash of English and French loyalties. It was a melting pot of hired blades where men fought not for king or country, but for the weight of coin in their purses. Mercenaries, the professional soldiers for hire of the medieval world, became the unpredictable wild card in this sprawling conflict. Skilled, ruthless, and utterly indifferent to national allegiances, they turned warfare into a brutal business transaction, one where loyalty could be bought and betrayal was just another bargaining chip. These weren't just desperate peasants picking up swords. Mercenary companies like the infamous Routiers or the Great Company were disciplined, mobile, and terrifyingly efficient. Many were veterans of Italy's endless wars, bringing innovations in tactics and siegecraft that outpaced feudal levies. Their services didn't come cheap, but for cash-strapped monarchs, they were often the only way to field an army when their own nobility was exhausted or rebellious. Yet mercenaries brought as many problems as solutions. Paid to fight, they had no incentive to end wars quickly. Dragging out campaigns meant more plunder and prolonged contracts. When pay ran dry, these same hired swords might turn on their employers, pillaging the countryside they were meant to protect. French villages suffered especially. The écorcheurs, flayers, earned their name by stripping the land bare whether friend or foe stood in their way. The English, with their tighter command structure and reliable longbow corps, relied less on mercenaries, but even they hired Genoese crossbowmen and Breton cavalry when needed. France, fractured and bankrupt at times, leaned on them heavily, blurring the lines between liberation and exploitation. The irony, many of these hired killers were foreign in name only, drawn from the war's ravaged frontiers, where borders meant little and survival meant everything. Beyond the bloodshed, mercenaries hinted at a seismic shift in warfare. Their professionalism, training, cohesion, and indifference to feudal loyalties prefigured the standing armies of early modern Europe. In a war that began with knights bound by chivalric oaths, their rise marked the cold pragmatism of a new era. War was no longer a noble's privilege, but a trade for those willing to sell their swords. And as the conflict dragged on, another force quietly took shape, one that would outlast both mercenary bands and medieval kings: the slow, relentless rise of centralized states, where loyalty to a nation would eventually matter more than loyalty to a paymaster. The age of the hired blade was ending, but its legacy would echo wherever gold and blood mixed on the battlefield. No grand battles or heroic last stands here, just the slow, grinding reality that wars aren't fought on courage alone. Behind every charge at Agincourt and every siege at Calais lay an invisible force more relentless than any army: money. The 100 Years' War didn't just consume lives, it devoured treasuries whole, leaving both England and France gasping under debts that would reshape kingdoms long after the last arrow fell. Take the ransom of King John II, captured at Poitiers, a staggering 3 million gold crowns, nearly twice France's annual revenue. To pay it, towns sold their church bells for scrap metal, peasants faced backbreaking taxes, and the crown pawned jewels to Italian bankers. Yet even this paled next to the endless costs of war itself. Armies demanded wages mercenaries wouldn't fight for patriotism. Castles required constant repairs, and scorched earth tactics turned fertile regions into wastelands incapable of feeding their own people. Trade routes, once lifelines of medieval prosperity, withered under the strain. English wool exports to Flanders, the backbone of their economy, collapsed as French blockades tightened. Ports like Bordeaux, once thriving hubs, saw their markets empty as piracy and siege warfare strangled commerce. Meanwhile, both crowns resorted to desperate measures, debasing coinage to stretch budgets, a move that sparked inflation so fierce it triggered peasant revolts like the Jacquerie and England's poll tax uprising. The war's deepest scars, though, were left on governance. To fund endless campaigns, kings centralized power like never before, demanding taxes directly from commoners rather than relying on feudal obligations. In England, Parliament gained influence by controlling the purse strings. while France's monarchy eroded regional autonomy to squeeze out every last coin. Both systems, born of desperation, laid groundwork for modern states, but at a brutal cost to ordinary people. Yet amid the ruin emerged unexpected resilience. Towns like Rouen rebuilt through sheer grit, craftsmen adapted to wartime shortages, and black markets flourished in the shadows. The war hadn't just broken economies, it forced innovation, proving that even in devastation, survival demanded more than gold, it required reinvention. And as the conflict finally sputtered to its end, one truth became undeniable. The battlefield might decide who won, but it was the ledger books that determined how long they could keep fighting. Before the 100 Years' War, a French peasant might never see their king, and an English farmer's loyalty often ended at the edge of their lord's fields. But as the conflict dragged on, something unexpected happened. Ordinary people began to see themselves not just as subjects, but as French or English. This wasn't just a war of crowns, it became a crucible forging two distinct national identities, each shaped by shared sacrifice and symbols that still echo today. Take the flags that fluttered over the chaos. The English cross of St. George, once just a royal banner, became a rallying point for archers who'd never set foot in London but now fought for something greater than local allegiances. Across the field, the French fleur-de-lis transformed from a dynastic emblem into a symbol of resistance stitched onto surcoats, carved into church walls, even whispered about in peasant revolts. These weren't just decorations, they were the birth of visual propaganda, uniting fragmented regions under a single idea of nationhood. Kings played their part too. Henry V didn't just lead an army at Agincourt, he crafted a narrative of divine favor, portraying England as God's chosen underdog. France, humiliated early in the war, countered with tales of martyrs and miracles, none more potent than Joan of Arc, the peasant girl whose very existence seemed to prove France's sacred destiny. Suddenly, victories weren't just about land, they were proof of national virtue. Yet the most profound shifts happened far from battlefields. Commoners who'd never met their king now paid taxes directly to fund his wars, binding them to a central authority in ways feudalism never had. War sermons painted enemies not as rival nobles, but as foreign devils threatening a shared way of life. Even language crystallized. English nobles stopped speaking French, while Parisian dialects became the true French speech. This awakening had a dark side, of course. Othering the enemy justified atrocities, and nationalism's fire could burn as fiercely as it inspired, but its legacy outlasted the war itself. By the time the guns fell silent, the medieval patchwork of fiefdoms had given way to something startlingly modern: the idea that a people, united by culture and cause, could shape their own destiny. The borders drawn in blood would shift again, but the identities forged in those flames still define nations today. And perhaps that's the war's most ironic twist. A conflict fought over dynastic claims ended up making those very dynasties obsolete, replaced by the far more powerful idea that a kingdom wasn't just land or a crown, it was a people. The thunder of cannons at Castellon didn't just mark the end of English ambitions in France, it forced a reckoning that would reshape an entire nation. With their continental empire in ruins and the treasury emptied by a century of war, England faced a bitter truth: the age of Plantagenet glory was over. Yet from this defeat emerged an unexpected pivot, one that would ultimately transform a humbled kingdom into a global power. The immediate aftermath was anything but triumphant. Returning soldiers brought not just shattered dreams, but economic chaos. Noble families who'd built fortunes on French lands saw their wealth evaporate overnight, while merchants groaned under the weight of unpaid war debts. Resentment festered, old alliances fractured, and within just 2 years of losing France, England plunged into the dynastic bloodbath known as the Wars of the Roses. The very symbols of military pride, swords that had clashed at Agincourt, now turned inward as York and Lancaster tore the kingdom apart. But beneath the turmoil, something vital was stirring. Cut off from continental ambitions, England's gaze began shifting westward toward the sea. The same longbowmen who once dominated French battlefields now found new purpose as sailors and explorers. Ports like Bristol and Plymouth, once mere supply stops for armies, became gateways to uncharted waters. Merchants who'd lost trade routes to France gambled on voyages beyond the horizon, laying the groundwork for an empire built on waves rather than battlefields. The war's greatest legacy for England wasn't what it lost, but what it was forced to become. Without the drain of endless French campaigns, energy once spent abroad now fueled domestic innovation, stronger centralized government, a growing middle class, and a navy that would one day rule the oceans. Even the turmoil of the Wars of Roses, brutal as it was, cleared the way for the Tudor dynasty and the golden age of Elizabethan exploration. In hindsight, England's retreat from France wasn't just an ending. It was the first step on a longer, stranger journey. The same island kingdom that had staked its identity on conquering neighbors would reinvent itself as a master of trade and discovery. And though the dream of a continental empire died at Castellon, the seeds of something far greater had already been planted, not in French soil, but in the restless spirit of a people learning to turn isolation into opportunity. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The scars of defeat ran deep, and the road ahead would be littered with fresh conflicts. But one thing was certain: England would never define itself by French battlefields again. The next chapter of its story would be written on a much wider stage, one where ships, not longbows, carried its ambitions to the ends of the earth. After more than a century of bloodshed, France stood victorious, but the fields they reclaimed were scorched, their towns hollowed out, and their people exhausted. Triumph on the battlefield didn't mean immediate peace or prosperity. Instead, what followed was a painstaking rebuilding, one that would transform a fractured feudal kingdom into Europe's first centralized superpower. The war had stripped France to its bones, but from that wreckage rose something far stronger, a nation united under an unshakable crown. At the heart of this transformation was the monarchy itself. Gone were the days when French kings had to beg their nobles for troops and taxes. The chaos of war had exposed the fatal weakness of feudalism. Its divisions made France vulnerable. Now, with English invaders finally expelled, the Valois kings moved swiftly to consolidate power. Step by step, they chipped away at noble privileges, replacing regional warlords with royal bureaucrats loyal to Paris. Taxes once siphoned off by local lords now flowed directly to the crown, funding standing armies that owed allegiance not to a duke but to the king himself. The change wasn't just political, it was psychological. Joan of Arc's legacy, though tinged with martyrdom, had given ordinary Frenchmen something unprecedented, a sense of shared identity. The war had blurred old distinctions between Norman, Burgundian, and Provençal. Survival demanded unity. Peasants who'd once barely known their king now saw themselves as part of La France, a nation worth defending. This quiet revolution in loyalty allowed the monarchy to bypass fractious nobles, appealing directly to the people, a tactic future rulers would exploit to build absolute power. Economically, recovery was slower but no less profound. Villages ravaged by chevauchés, the English scorched earth raids, were rebuilt with sturdier walls and broader fields. Trade routes, long strangled by war, reopened under royal protection, weaving regions together in a web of commerce. Paris, once a besieged city, blossomed into Europe's cultural capital, its university attracting thinkers who'd shaped the Renaissance. Even the art of war evolved. France's embrace of gunpowder at Castellon didn't just win battles. It spurred innovations in metallurgy and engineering that would fuel future conquests. Yet the true measure of France's resurgence lay beyond its borders. By the 16th century, the same kingdom that had once teetered on collapse would field armies capable of challenging the Habsburgs, fund explorers to rival Portugal and Spain, and cultivate a court so dazzling it set the standard for all Europe. The 100 Years' War, for all its horrors, had forged a state ruthlessly efficient in extracting resources, commanding loyalty, and projecting power, a blueprint for empire. But beneath the glittering surface, tension simmered. The very centralization that saved France would later breed rebellion, and the absolutism born from wartime necessity would one day fuel revolution. For now, though, a kingdom that had survived dismemberment stood taller than ever, its gaze fixed on a future where its voice would shape the continent's destiny. The war had ended, but France's ascent was just beginning. Few figures in history have burned as bright or as briefly as Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl who led armies to victory, only to be betrayed and burned at the stake before her 20th birthday. Yet long after the flames at Rouen consumed her body, her legend grew into something far greater, a spark that reignited French pride and reshaped the very soul of a nation. Her military achievements alone were staggering. In just 9 months, she shattered the siege of Orléans, routed the English at Pâté, and paved the way for Charles VII's coronation at Rheims, victories that came not from experience, but from an unshakable belief in her divine mission. But what truly set Joan apart wasn't her battlefield instincts. It was her ability to make hardened soldiers and skeptical nobles believe in the impossible. When she stood in armor before the Dauphin, when she picked up a fallen banner to rally fleeing troops, she didn't just command, she inspired. Then came the fall. Captured by Burgundian forces, sold to the English, and subjected to a sham trial designed to break her, Joan faced accusations of heresy with startling clarity. Her interrogators expected a frightened girl. What they got was a mind sharper than most theologians. Even her eventual recantation, under threat of torture, lasted only days before she defiantly reclaimed her visions. That courage in the face of fire turned her execution into something more than martyrdom. It became a reckoning. The aftermath was as swift as it was ironic. Within years, the same church that condemned her reopened her case, posthumously clearing her name. Farmers reported miracles at her execution site. Ballads celebrated her deeds, and by the 19th century she was canonized, a saint for the nation she'd helped save. But Joan's true legacy wasn't in relics or rituals. It was in the way her story crystallized France's emerging identity. She became the symbol of resistance against impossible odds, the proof that even a humble girl could alter destiny. Centuries later, her allure endures precisely because it defies simple labels. Was she a warrior, a mystic, a political pawn, perhaps all three? But above all, Joan reminds us that history's most enduring figures aren't always the ones who wield the most power. Sometimes they're the ones who dare to listen to voices no one else can hear, and in doing so change the world. And as France rebuilt from the ashes of war, another transformation was unfolding, one that would redefine how wars were waged and kingdoms governed. Because while Joan's story was ending, the age of gunpowder and standing armies was just beginning. No general, no matter how brilliant, could afford to ignore the muddy slopes of Crecy or the rain-soaked fields of Agincourt. Because the 100 Years' War wasn't just fought with swords and arrows, but with minds sharp enough to turn dirt and weather into weapons. What separated the victors from the defeated wasn't just courage. It was a ruthless understanding of strategy, a chess master's eye for exploiting every advantage. And here's the remarkable thing: those medieval battlegrounds still teach us about leadership, adaptability, and the cost of clinging to the past. Take Touraine, the unsung general that shaped every major clash. Edward III didn't just pick a hill at Crecy, he sculpted a killing field. Ditches dug overnight forced French cavalry into funneled death traps, while his archers' high ground turned arrows into artillery. Decades later, Henry V repeated the lesson at Agincourt, using sodden earth to immobilize armored knights. Both kings grasped a fundamental truth: battles aren't won by strength alone, but by controlling the space where strength meets its limits. Then there's adaptability, the difference between surviving and collapsing. The French entered the war believing armored knights were unbeatable, only to be humbled by English longbows. Yet by Castellon, they'd flipped the script, deploying cannons so brutally that medieval warfare itself became obsolete. Meanwhile, England's early triumphs hardened into dogma. Their longbow formations, once revolutionary, grew predictable against enemies who'd finally learned to adapt. But perhaps the war's sharpest lesson is psychological. Joan of Arc didn't just break sieges, she shattered the myth of English invincibility, proving morale could be as decisive as steel. The best commanders, whether the Black Prince exploiting confusion at Poitiers or French tacticians using gunpowder's terror at Formigny, understood that victory often hinges on breaking the enemy's will before breaking their lines. These aren't dusty relics of history. The same principles echo in modern boardrooms and battlefields. Outmaneuver, don't outmuscle, innovate or stagnate, strike where the enemy feels safest. Because whether you're a medieval king or a modern leader, one rule never changes: the moment you stop learning from the land, the enemy, and your own mistakes, you've already lost. And if there's a single thread connecting these lessons, it's this: the deadliest trap isn't a ditch or an arrow storm, it's the belief that yesterday's tactics will win tomorrow's wars. The commanders who thrived in this conflict knew better. They wrote the playbook on turning weakness into advantage, and their strategies still demand our attention centuries later. Now, as we step back from these battlefields, another layer of the war comes into focus: not the clashes of armies, but the quieter, deeper shifts in how societies remembered, mourned, and mythologized the bloodshed that defined them. The fighting may have ended, but its stories were only beginning. The clash of steel at Agincourt and the fiery defiance of Joan of Arc didn't just shape history, they became the raw material for legends. Long after the last arrow fell, the 100 Years' War kept fighting on in a different arena, the boundless realm of storytelling. From Shakespeare's gripping verses to Hollywood's sweeping battle scenes, this medieval conflict has been reshaped, romanticized, and reimagined by every generation that encountered it. But why does a war fought 6 centuries ago still ignite our collective imagination? Because buried beneath the dates and treaties lies something timeless, a saga of underdogs and titans, faith and betrayal, where history and myth blur into something larger than life. Take Shakespeare's Henry V, where the mud and gore of Agincourt transform into a rousing anthem of brotherhood. The real battle was far messier than the bard sent. Crispin's Day speech, but that's the point: art isn't shackled to facts. Shakespeare distilled the chaos into a single, soaring idea: that ordinary men could become immortal through shared struggle. Centuries later, Laurence Olivier and Kenneth Branagh would bring those words to film, each adaptation reflecting its era. Olivier's wartime patriotism in 1944, Branagh's gritty realism in 1989. The war stayed the same, but its meaning evolved with the audiences who needed it. Then there's Joan of Arc, history's most malleable heroine. To some, she's the devout warrior of Carl Theodor Dreyer's silent masterpiece, The Passion of Joan of Arc, her face a canvas of anguish and grace. To others, she's the action hero of The Messenger, or even the irreverent cartoon rebel in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Each version reveals less about the 15th century and more about the times that resurrected her, whether as a symbol of resistance, faith, or pure defiance. Modern media keeps finding fresh angles on the conflict. Video games like A Plague Tale weave the war's brutality into their narratives. while novels like Bernard Cornwell's Agincourt force readers to smell the blood and sweat of the longbowmen. Even Monty Python and the Holy Grail, though set earlier, borrows the war's absurdities, the mud, the mismatched battles, the sheer randomness of medieval combat. But here's the fascinating twist. These retellings aren't just entertainment. They're how history breathes and adapts. Every film, play, or novel refracts the past through the lens of the present, asking new questions. Was Henry V a hero or a warmonger? Was Joan a saint or a pawn? The answers shift because we do. And in that endless retelling, the 100 Years' War stays alive, no longer just a chapter in a textbook, but a mirror held up to our own struggles, fears, and dreams. What emerges isn't a single, frozen version of events, but a living dialogue between then and now. The facts remain, but their meaning, that's a story we keep rewriting together. And somewhere between the archives and the silver screen, between Shakespeare's verse and a gamer's controller, the war's true legacy endures, not just in what happened, but in why we can't stop retelling it. The thunder of cannons at Castellon didn't just signal the end of medieval warfare, it heralded the birth of a new era where gunpowder and discipline would overshadow lance and armor. Yet if we zoom out, the 100 Years' War wasn't just a pivot point for its time. It was a preview of principles that still define combat today. Strip away the chainmail and longbows, and you'll find timeless truths about warfare. The side that adapts fastest survives. Technology reshapes battlefields overnight, and no army, no matter how brave, can fight on an empty stomach. Take the longbow's rise at Crecy. What made it revolutionary wasn't just its range or power. It was the way England leveraged a force multiplier. A single trained archer could down a knight worth years of training and a fortune in armor, much like how today's drones neutralize tanks costing millions. Both weapons democratized warfare, proving that innovation often favors the nimble over the heavily invested. Logistics, the unglamorous backbone of war, played just as critical a role then as now. English chevauchée raids burning crops and starving towns mirror modern scorched earth tactics, while the siege of Calais exposed a truth every general knows: supply lines win wars as surely as battles do. Napoleon famously said armies march on their stomachs. Medieval commanders learned it centuries earlier when dysentery crippled more soldiers than swords. Yet perhaps the most striking parallel lies in the power of myth. Joan of Arc's ability to rally broken troops with sheer conviction finds echoes in modern propaganda, where narratives can turn retreats into strategic withdrawals and atrocities into necessary measures. The medieval church's crusade rhetoric and today's media spin share a common goal: transforming flesh and blood soldiers into unstoppable believers. But here's the twist: for all the changes, some lessons remain set in stone. The French learned too late at Agincourt that clinging to tradition, their glorious cavalry charges invites disaster. Just as armies in World War I initially dismissed machine guns as cowardly. Adaptation has always separated victors from casualties, whether facing arrows or algorithms. And while drones replace trebuchets and cyberwarfare eclipses castle sieges, the core equation stays the same: outthink, outmaneuver, or perish. The 100 Years' War didn't just change how battles were fought, it revealed the DNA of conflict itself, strands we still recognize in every modern engagement. From the importance of terrain, now extended to digital domains, to the psychological toll on soldiers, then called melancholia, now PTSD, the past whispers to the present in unexpected ways. The armor and weapons evolve, but the game, its rules, its ruthlessness remains eerily familiar. And as we step back from these battlefields, another realization dawns: the war's legacy isn't confined to tactics or technology. Its deepest scars and brightest triumphs live on in the stories we tell, the identities we forge, and the fragile lines between glory and infamy. Because history seldom stays buried, it lingers, waiting for us to uncover its echoes in the world we've built. Even after 6 centuries, the 100 Years' War refuses to surrender all its secrets. For every battle we can map in gruesome detail, there are shadowy corners where history falls silent, missing documents, cryptic chronicles, and decisions that still baffle scholars today. These aren't just academic footnotes, they're tantalizing gaps where the past whispers what if. Take the fate of the Fieschi letter, a mysterious 14th century document that allegedly revealed Edward II of England, officially murdered in 1327, actually escaped to live in exile. Could this shocking claim explain why his son, Edward III, pressed his French claims so aggressively? The letter vanished centuries ago, leaving historians to debate whether it was political propaganda, an elaborate hoax, or a truth too dangerous to preserve. Then there's the enigma of Charles VI of France, whose bouts of madness reshaped the war. Contemporary accounts describe him howling like a wolf and forgetting his own name, but modern experts still argue over the cause. Was it schizophrenia, porphyria, or even lead poisoning from royal tableware? Without definitive evidence, his illness remains a tragic wild card in the war's momentum, forever altering France's fate in ways no strategist could predict. Some mysteries hinge on the untold stories of those history overlooked. We know the names of kings and knights, but what of the women who held besieged castles in their husbands' absences, or the peasants who smuggled food past enemy lines? The war's unofficial chroniclers, brewers, monks, and midwives left fragments of their world in merchant ledgers and parish records, waiting to be pieced together. Even battlefield archaeology raises new questions. At Agincourt, soil analysis suggests the French cavalry charge might have stalled not just from mud, but from hidden pits dug by English troops, a tactic absent from contemporary accounts. And at Castellon, where gunpowder reigned, researchers still debate whether the English defeat came from bad intelligence or sheer disbelief that warfare had changed so drastically. These gaps aren't failures of history, they're invitations. Every disputed decision, every missing manuscript, reminds us that the past isn't a static monolith, it's a living puzzle where each discovery can rewrite the narrative. And perhaps that's the war's final lesson. The more we learn, the more we realize how much remains just beyond our grasp, waiting for the next curious mind to uncover it. As we pull back from these lingering questions, another layer of the conflict comes into focus, not the battles or politics, but the raw human emotions that transcended the centuries. Because while treaties fade and borders shift, the echoes of hope, fear, and resilience never truly disappear. As the dust settles on these 25 battlefields, we're left with more than just tales of bloodshed and conquest. Each clash, from the muddy slaughter of Agincourt to the cannon smoke of Castellon, was a pivot point, a moment where history teetered before lurching in a new direction. What makes these battles unforgettable isn't just their scale or carnage, but how they reveal the fragile threads holding societies together. A kingdom's pride, a peasant girl's faith, or the stark reality that no armor could stop a well-aimed arrow or a cannonball. Consider the unexpected legacies. The same war that devastated France also forged it into a united powerhouse. England's loss overseas sparked a maritime revolution that would eventually birth an empire. And Joan of Arc's martyrdom became the kindling for a national identity that still burns bright today. Even in defeat, these battles reshaped cultures, borders, and the very idea of what it meant to belong to a nation. But beyond kings and treaties, there's a human pulse beneath these stories. The archer who stood knee-deep in mud at Crecy, the burghers of Calais offering their lives for their city, the nameless smiths who forged the cannons that ended an era, their choices, large and small, stacked like stones to build the world we know. That's the real lesson. History isn't just made in grand speeches or throne rooms. but in the grit and desperation of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary moments. If there's one thread connecting all 25 battles, it's this: progress in war comes at a price. Every innovation, longbows, gunpowder, standing armies, brought both victory and unforeseen consequences. The medieval world crumbled not with a whimper, but amid the thunder of charges and the screams of the fallen. And yet, from that chaos emerged the seeds of modernity, stronger nations, new technologies, and a growing understanding that war's true cost is measured not in territory but in lives. Your turn now. Which of these clashes left you awestruck? Was it the sheer audacity of Henry V's band of brothers, or Joan's defiant stand at Orléans? Drop your thoughts below. We're all custodians of these stories, keeping their lessons alive. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's turning points, hit that subscribe button. The past is vast, unpredictable, and far from finished with us. Until next time, keep listening for the echoes of these battles. They have more to say than you might think.